I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. Today, we are discussing AI and the medical device industry in the United States. AI offers immense opportunity to improve the health and well-being of society. Our bodies, whether they are working correctly or importantly, when they're not working correctly, produce so much information that we are just now beginning to collect and maybe understand. Given the volume of that information, AI might be a perfect innovation to be able to identify the next treatment, diagnostic, or cure breakthrough. At the same time, health and life sciences sector is probably one of the most heavily regulated in the United States. So it might not be surprising that AI is creating many legal challenges in the space. Today's episode is also part of our continuing AI mastery series, where we discuss how AI is creating issues across legal disciplines. If you've not listened to prior episodes and are interested in AI and the law, check them out. They're really a great resource. They cover material ranging from AI and competition, antitrust law, copyright, energy policy, cyber transactions, and so much more. They're a valuable tool for anybody who's looking to be an AI lawyer or just curious about how AI and law are coming together. With that, let's dive into AI and medical devices. To discuss, I've invited two of my partners, Mike Heyl and Jodi Scott, to the podcast. Both Jodi and Mike are members of our life sciences team and focus their practices on guiding medical device manufacturers on the many regulations that determine how those companies can innovate, operate, and go to market. And as you'll hear, both Mike and Jodi are spending much of their time focused on AI. Mike, Jodi, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So maybe we can first start with an overview, because I think this, as I was mentioning, is very difficult to understand not only how AI is creating specific legal challenges in the space, but even to understand the landscape of how medical devices are regulated in the United States. So let's start there. What does the framework look like? And then importantly, we'll get into how AI is perhaps creating unique issues within that framework.
Yeah, great. So it's a really exciting time with respect to AI and medical devices. But in terms of how AI-based or AI-powered devices are reviewed and approved by FDA, FDA is continuing to use its existing framework, which is really a risk-based framework that looks at both the use of the product, how you plan to use it, and the technology that the product uses to accomplish its goal. And so they continue to use the same framework. It's an array of products that are exempt from 510K pre-market notifications, de novo authorizations for products that are novel but more of a moderate risk, and PMAs for things that are high risk, new novel technologies. And so the agencies worked really hard to try and fit everything into that program. But I will say, FDA has been actually reviewing and improving products with software since the 70s, and they actually have approved products that have sort of early versions of AI going back all the way to the 1980s.
I'll add to that. There are other aspects of not just the AI that's being used in medical devices, but also AI that's being used in quality management systems and in manufacturing operations. For example, AI is opening up many opportunities to make the design and development process simpler, to model different devices and how to evaluate them, verify that they're effective, validate their use. It's also being used with manufacturing and pulling data and looking at yields and making sure that we've got production schedules right or the most efficient. So there are many different ways that AI is being used in the medical device space, in addition to just those medical devices which incorporate it, but it's also being used for the production.
And then we should probably also mention, which is a little bit more in your space, that medical device companies are companies, first and foremost, and they are subject to all of the general rules that are now starting to come into force around the use of AI, both in operations and governance, and frankly, just by employees. within an organization. So there are quite a few different rules that come into play when you're a medical device manufacturer.
And I'm interested in kind of some of those same themes that you're mentioning around transparency and ethical use. But before going into that, maybe an important kind of distinction that I see in this space, and I'm interested in your reactions to it, is that in many spaces, the difficulty that we have with AI is that the regulators, frankly, just don't understand it. The regulators here who are coming up with the legal frameworks for which AI is going to be governed, they are hearing about, well, all of the dangers that AI can create. And at the same time saying, well, how do we allow for innovation? And they don't fully understand how the technology works. In your space, the governments have developed a body of experts and more kind of technological forward people to understand how the regulations should apply to innovations in this space. How are you seeing that apply with respect to AI? Are you seeing that as still kind of the larger confusion about how the technology works that we see elsewhere? Or do you see that within the medical device space that that's more well understood given, Jodi, as you said, the decades of experience perhaps that they have already had with this type of technology?
My impression is that FDA is probably a little bit is in front of other government agencies because they have had to be, right? Industry always leads regulation. And so they have had to figure out how do we review these things? How do we establish standards? How do we determine what is good enough? And so one of the things the agency has been doing is, they have convened meetings with industry. They have hired a large number of technical engineers to be able to understand, both what is the application, how do you test that application, how do you deal with issues that show up in that application, and that is really by kind of increasing their bench strength with technical folks to be able to do those things. They've also established centers of excellence for digital health that covers not just AI, but anything with a software-based application. And they are really trying to be partners with industry in order to be able to get these things approved. I mean, I think sometimes people forget part of their mission is to actually facilitate innovation and bring new technologies to market. And so, they're all technical people. They get very excited about these sort of things the same way we do, but they also have a public health role. And so they want to make sure when these things get released that they are safe and effective and they're, not doing harm to patients everywhere.
No, and I'll add that on the compliance side, that you're exactly right, Scott. The regulations, for example, the quality management system regulations for medical devices called the quality system regulation, that's been in place since 1996. And so it's basically on an FDA inspection or an audit, for example, it's applying those key concepts to evolving technology and technology that is evolving, as you noted, very quite rapidly. But there are certainly differences in how you would apply the quality management system concepts from one company that's manufacturing the same thing on a production line versus a software company that's utilizing AI. An example would be the supplier controls, how you qualify a supplier. Usually you will go in, you'll assess them, you'll audit them, and then you'll put an agreement in front of them and identify the requirements that you need them to comply with. Some of the folks in the space for AI, they understand that they're the only companies that can possibly do that. And so they're going to give you their form and say, nope, if you're going to use my platform, if you're going to use my open algorithm, you are going to comply with this because we can't take the risk of somebody coming in and manipulating it or changing it or affecting how our product works. So sometimes it's a matter of flipping things the other way. And those are the sorts of concepts that at times an FDA investigator may not appreciate. And so you really need to pay attention during an FDA inspection or a notified body audit to really kind of explain the landscape and explain the concepts that are needed to ensure that your device is performing as intended and is as safe and effective.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating, as I'm hearing kind of your describe this, because, in some ways, the way you're describing FDA in their ability of understanding this is probably where many regulators want to move in terms of their technological abilities. I mean, we hear increasingly about AGs in the United States hiring technologists to be able to dive deeper into these things, to be able to decipher, where the legal issues are popping. And maybe that kind of brings me to my next question, because when you were providing the overview about how the regulatory apparatus works with respect to medical devices, you were using some of those key words and key themes that we are seeing over and over and over again with respect to AI regulation. Issues surrounding validation or accuracy, and issues around transparency. How do you know when AI is in the particular tools? How do you ensure ethical use and try to address bias related concerns? How do you account for privacy and data security? I mean, all of these things are kind of things that we see constantly. Interested maybe in your perspectives on that and how those issues are being sorted in connection with both the development of tools and then in their commercialization. And then maybe after that, Mike, I'm interested in the other issue that you've teed up, which is around how AI itself can be used as part of your overall manufacturing process. But let's talk about the actual commercialization, how this can create both opportunities and risks as it's commercialized. Maybe Jodi, I'll start with you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I will say, FDA is learning right along with the rest of us, right? So originally for the first kind of products that really said, we are AI enabled, we are an AI powered product, FDA asked questions about what's your data source? What fed your algorithm? How did you develop it? What was your validation look like? Did you have a nice cross section of different users, urban versus rural, in your validation set? So they've always been good at asking those questions, but over time they have gotten much better at asking those questions, and they've become more refined and more targeted. And so that means that, and they have the benefit of seeing everybody else's applications. So industry has had to be better about planning to be able to answer those questions, making sure that you understand where that data came from, whether you have rights to that data. How did you segregate a data population so that you can answer the questions to FDA, as opposed to sort of be caught back on your heels when they ask a question because you didn't plan for that sort of thing at the front end. I will also say, FDA has not yet approved what I call sort of active AI, meaning a device that is continuously learning and adapting as it's operating in the commercial space. They're not yet comfortable that they can totally trust the AI. They do want a human in that process, but I do think they will get there. It's just a matter of time of getting them to an appropriate comfort level in a way that they can be confident that it's not going to sort of run amok, and that in the running of amok, it's going to harm people. Wrong diagnosis, wrong treatment that they didn't need, missing a treatment, those sorts of things.
I mean, that issue, or, what I think some folks would think of as like agentic AI, the implementation of different types of agents that are making decisions, which then kind of spin on other decisions, is kind of probably the future of the space, much more so than generative AI was. And maybe, Mike, interested in your perspective, because human oversight in that process is a difficult balance to strike, including, and maybe more importantly, many folks think of it as a risk-based decision. But when you're talking about the use of a medical device or a medical procedure, the risk of getting that wrong is much higher.
Right. And for right now, the medical devices that are cleared or approved with AI, it's mostly adjunctive. And so it will take a radiologist to review certain images or to review certain slices, if you will, of photos to say you might want to look here or focus here, but it is not to be replacing the actual diagnostic expertise that a medical professional has. So I think that there is a fine line here that we're going to see whether it evolves, and if so, how, as to whether the AI can be used actually for diagnostic purposes as opposed to adjunctive diagnostic purposes. I know, Jodi, you may have thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be amazing, but then what are the rest of us going to do if we're no longer in the process? All of our doctors and nurses, I guess they'll just be delivering the treatment. But FDA, a lot of the algorithms and a lot of the AI is used in medical devices. I always ask them, like, where is your AI when they say they have AI? So is it that you use the AI to actually develop an algorithm and then the algorithm is what the software is? Or are you actually having AI in the software and what is it doing in the software? So, for example, if you have AI that is organizing medical records and pulling forward information so you make sure the doctor sees it, there are certain functions in the medical device that FDA isn't really all that concerned about other than how it interfaces with the rest of it. So you're not going to get questions about that. But if your AI algorithm is actually taking all the data in the EMR and and analyzing it and saying, I think this patient might be at risk for cancer, you should send them to be screened, get a mammography, get a colonoscopy because of these indicators. That's the type of thing where FDA wants to know, how did you get there? What was the analysis like? And how do we know we can trust the AI? So there's AI in different places in these devices. Some of them are more concerning, some of them are less. But in any event, FDA is almost always going to have questions.
Right. And I'll add to that is where the AI is there may be instances where the AI is analyzing the performance of the device itself. And that will be data that are coming back to the company or back to the manufacturer. And this is where you've got the old regulations that really need to evolve and apply to what is being seen because of the AI. And what I mean by that is the performance of a device. If it is not performing as intended, it is not meeting specification, that needs to be evaluated. Do we need to make a design change to the product to make it better? Is it not performing because we're drifting in a particular way, and it's not providing the same level of accuracy or precision? Is this a malfunction out in the field? Did this not perform as intended? And now we have to treat this more as a complaint and run that through our complaints analysis. And if it is a complaint, is that a reportable complaint to the FDA? If upon recurrence, would it be likely to cause or contribute to a serious injury or patient event? So there's a lot to consider when you're using your AI to monitor the performance of your device, whether it's directly or whether it's even indirectly, if it's pulling data from the internet, for example.
And I mean, is it the case that AI is maybe kind of a blessing and a curse in that regard, Mike? As I'm reminded in this conversation of an interview that we did on a prior podcast in a very different context about AI and employment law. And on that podcast, I had one of the commissioners from the EEOC talk about his perspective with respect to how AI is being deployed in the employment space. And, I had initially thought that they would probably be concerned about AI, and at least this commissioner in the Biden administration, was very progressive about thinking about AI with employment. And his point was, he's like, I get that bias concerns are really important with respect to artificial intelligence, but who discriminates more than machines? Humans, right? And so in some ways, the AI can actually be a help to be able to eliminate bias more than it is to emphasize the concerns how bias could be introduced. And obviously there's other sides to that same point, but I'm interested in your perspective on that, because as you're now letting machines to be able to oversee the quality control perhaps of a particular medical device, they're going to spot things that perhaps humans didn't, or they're going to spot trends or safety concerns that may have been around for a number of years that humans did never appreciate or never were able to spot in all of that data, because the data was not accessible or the data was so voluminous that it was impossible to identify those trends.
You're absolutely right.
Yep.
Yep. I mean, I will tell you, I think, Mike, you've given the same advice I have, which is if you have a social media page, you might not want to turn on the comment features, because any information that gets posted up on your social media page, it's now your information and you've got to deal with it. And FDA expects you to address every one of those complaints that shows up on your social media page, because now you know about it. And it can be anything from the legitimate product problems to things that are a little bit wacky. but you still have to follow up and investigate and evaluate and make decisions about it. And so the same thing can be said with respect to AI, that you've now got so much more data than we ever imagined you could ever have coming in at you, and you've got to deal with that data. And I would think I'm going to say most companies are probably not resourced to be able to deal with that much data. And I think your only option is to use the AI to help you deal with the data. But at some point, you're going to get to part of the process where you need humans.
I agree. And Scott, you had said it's kind of a blessing and a curse. And I would agree. And Jodi, your example of social media, I totally agree with this. And it really kind of shows the evolution of what companies really need to be paying attention to. Because when the regulations were initially, written in 1996, there really wasn't an internet or social media to be concerned about. You would receive product performance from phone calls, from letters, of how your product is performing. Then when social media came along, exactly what Jodi was saying, people would start putting comments on web pages and comments on your web page. And it was, well, now we need to evaluate those to see if those are complaints. And now the AI and bots are going out and actually pulling it and providing it to you. So it's certainly evolutionary, and companies are getting a lot more data because of the technology and the evolution of it. I think the other area too, it would be just in supplier performance. A lot of times with suppliers, they're evaluated maybe on a quarterly basis, or they're evaluated annually to see, are they meeting our requirements? Are we getting on-time deliveries to the products that we're receiving, or the components that we're receiving meet spec? Now with the AI and the technology, it's being done in real time. And so it's beginning to detect a supplier related issue, that you may have product that's out in the field that was manufactured with something that now your AI is detecting may not have met spec, or you have a long-term supplier that's always it performed well and responded to changes that you've needed, and now you're seeing, this isn't really what we needed. What do we do with this supplier? So it's really a matter of looking at agreements, looking at contracts, looking at how we deal with the data that we're receiving in real time to ensure that we're complying with our own procedures. Because if FDA were to walk in the door and see that you're sitting on a stockpile of information that your supplier isn't performing or meeting your requirements, they're going to ask questions why you're not taking action.
Yeah, it's kind of exciting to think that you can have all this data at your fingertips, but in having the data, you got to be prepared to deal with it.
And I mean, that's, I think, exactly right. Having all of the data probably is, if you think on the blessing side of it, they're like, oh, well, there's opportunities to innovate and that we've never had before. Interested in your perspective about how the industry is either embracing or shying away from AI, and whether they see that as really the next big thing. And then maybe interested also in your thoughts about how maybe organizations who don't necessarily see themselves as a traditional medical device manufacturer are now maybe blurring lines, especially as they come up with new and advanced AI-based agents, which are designed to offer all sorts of information, including if somebody types in, hey, I'm experiencing shortness of breath and pain in my chest, what should I do? And, does that constitute a potential medical device now, even though it was never really intended for that purpose? Where do you see the developments in the space and the opportunities, and perhaps kind of where some traps for the unwary?
Sure. So for the manufacturers that are just putting things out on the web, for example, and diagnosing, for example, if somebody puts in, Scott, as if the example that you just provided, I'm having these symptoms. What does that mean? I mean, if there is something that is now going onto the web and looking for diagnoses and trying to pull information and AI generation of a diagnosis, that certainly would meet the definition, or certainly could meet the definition of a medical device if that is what it is intended to do. So I do think that anybody who's developing software that's utilizing AI to perform those sorts of functions really needs to pay attention to what the definition of a medical device is, and know that if that's what they're putting out into the marketplace or and associating with their company, they will need, if they're doing business in the US, likely need to get a clearance or an approval. And some of this will require extensive validation. It will require sometimes even clinical data to support some of the diagnostic aspects if that's what's being provided. Now, Jodi, what your
Yeah,
thoughts are?
let me maybe back up a little bit from that. In the US, when you talk about kind of software only applications, there was actually a change in the definition of a medical device after years of wrangling around who was going to regulate medical software. There were factions that said, well, I don't care who does it. I don't want it to be FDA because they're going to overdo it. And FDA kind of stayed its hand for a while, but nobody else stepped in to regulate it. And so they said, all right, it needs to be regulated because the industry is moving too fast and things are coming out and somebody's got to be paying attention to make sure the patients aren't harmed. So they came up with a framework to regulate it and they worked with Congress and modified the definition of medical devices. And so now it's set up a little bit like a law school exam. So there's things that are medical devices, and then there's carve outs from the definition of medical devices. And then there's a whole section of software functions where FDA says, we could regulate you, but we're not going to. You're super low risk. And so it's a little law school exam-y like. And so your example, it's a little bit devil in the details. It's a little bit how you do it, how transparent you are when you do it, and what is the seriousness of the recommendation that you're making. So how you do it as to whether or not FDA is going to actively regulate you. And so it's it's surprisingly complicated in the US, just because you're in the medical space and your software, that is not enough. But, as Mike says, for companies that are sort of in this, we're putting things out there, it touches on health, it's possible you could be a regulated medical device. And I would say you need to figure that out.
It's almost in some
no,
ways, Jodi, like the time, and I know you're still deep in the space around wearables, right? Because I mean, that was an area that really pushed this issue and made it forefront for many organizations who were developing direct to consumer products that they never really thought of themselves as creating a medical device, but it was capturing things like heart rates or capturing things like blood pressure, capturing, all different types of things relating to the human body. And maybe some of them found themselves in medical device land, even though they were intending to arrive somewhere else.
or wanted to be in the medical device land. Or we actually have a lot of clients who come to us and say, well, I don't really want to be a medical device today because I'm not really ready to be fully regulated. But in a couple years, that's where we want to be because that's where the money is, right? I want to be in a position where I can get, Medicare, Medicaid reimbursement. I can get reimbursed for this. And so in order to get that reimbursement, I need to be a regulated medical device. And so I want to get there, but I don't want to be here today. How do I avoid being there today? And so that I can get there on my pace. And then we have lots of clients who don't think they're medical device manufacturers until they find out, usually through a love letter from FDA, that they might actually be a medical device. And that's not how you want to find out.
Or a competitor.
Yeah.
So maybe then it takes me kind of to my final set of questions of trying to understand, where the risks lie for not being able to sort out this complicated area. Because I got to imagine that, they're part regulatory as you're emphasizing. They obviously create a significant litigation risk, when you're talking about a bad outcome for an individual. There's probably got to be a number of liability issues as it relates between suppliers and the manufacturers, and as all of these different software and hardware are interacting with one another in connection with the treatment or diagnosis of an individual, can create all sorts of issues. How are you kind of communicating kind of the body of these risks as people innovate and go to market in this space?
As we've said on earlier, it is evolutionary, and from the perspective I come from, which is manufacturing quality management system, it is finding ways to apply the regulation to the AI and what's happening and documenting what those rationales are. Because I think the risk comes in multiple ways. The risks are the FDA investigator may not understand what it is you're doing. They may apply a very, very old school draconian application of the regulations to the software. It very well may be, as we talked about before, you're sitting on a stockpile of data and you're supposed to do something with that data if you become aware of it, whether take corrective action, initiate a nonconformance, and investigate what that is. It's pulling information from the field that may be complaints. So I think the advice that we've been giving and I've been giving is really just to be mindful of what those data are and applying those data to the regulations that exist right now, and looking at the definitions and seeing how these fit into the definitions, and because many times they will fit into the definition of a complaint or of a nonconformance. Again, those are the compliance risks and the compliance challenges. But again, they could also be helpful in helping you comply with the regulations, using the AI to look at hiccups in your manufacturing process, things that could make your yields better, things that could make your process more efficient, or identify issues earlier in the process rather than getting a product all the way at the end only to test it and find out that it doesn't meet spec. So there are many positive ways that the AI can be used to keep you out of compliance issues with FDA during an inspection, or just in general to meet your specifications and meet your requirements.
And I agree with Mike. It's sort of being thoughtful and knowing what you've got and where the risks are. And I think for medical device companies, for medical devices generally, I mean, it is super exciting the kind of technology is coming out. So, for example, we have software that is doing cognitive behavioral therapy based on AI for patients that have ADHD, they have depression, irritable bowel syndrome, right? So, that doesn't seem like this type of thing you can treat with software, but it is, and it works, and there's clinical data behind it that demonstrates that it works. But these are applications that are affecting people's health by design. And everybody wants there to be a positive impact, but there very well could be a negative impact. And so being mindful of that. There's lots of issues around products liability for physicians who are have malpractice. There's all the data issues because all of these applications have tons of patient data. There are new issues around how these things are reimbursed because that has been very difficult for medical device manufacturers. We think it is getting better, hopefully going to be better this year to get reimbursement for these things. But with reimbursement comes obligations for other federal laws. So it's incredibly complex. I suspect that there will be new legislation this year that applies to AI in the US. I hope maybe at the federal level, but certainly at the state level. There are so many issues around the use of AI. And I will also say one thing that is sort of stark, and you don't think about it until you think about it, is the production and distribution models for software and AI are entirely different. You don't have a manufacturing facility anymore. You have a set of offices and a whole bunch of computers and some big databases. So all of those things are just very different. And I do think, to Mike's point, the old rules still work mostly for what we've got right now. But I do think there will become a time where there needs to be some legislative changes to account for how these things are just fundamentally different.
And I think that's exactly right. And so I would say good advice would be just watching what's coming out of the agency. I know that this year on the docket, they're supposed to come out with a guidance document for quality management systems for digital health and AI products. So monitoring that and seeing if that's still going to come out. It was on the schedule for guidance documents for 2026 fiscal year. And as far as just be mindful of the human element as well. And this is this advice that I give to clients all the time, particularly with quality system records, complaints, is you're seeing a whole bunch of new data coming in, or just an abundance of data in general, more than you may be used to. If the quality records include a human element of a narrative, just be careful what's being said. Be careful in describing a complaint, or if you receive information from the web about a person's experience with a medical device, the AI is either bringing it in or it's the application of AI in the medical device. if comments are made in complaint files, like, oh my gosh, this AI, is algorithm's going to kill somebody if we don't watch out. I mean, things like that, those are comments that are a lightning rod for a regulator to come in and focus on. And it could really lead to significant regulatory enforcement action as well as product liability. So again, never underestimate the human element and the human side of these things and what's being said and what's lurking in your complaint files or in your quality system files.
Really good practice points. And I'm clearly learning there's a lot here, not only about AI, but in general for this particular space, which makes, the job for folks who are either fully in the medical device space or just frankly now becoming a medical device company, given their innovations, it becomes very important to be watching the developments, Michael, that you're describing around in the FDA and then all the things that are swarming around it. That's got to be difficult to try to stay on the top of that. And I understand that you're there to help. Well, with that, Jodi, Mike, thanks so much for joining the Data Chronicles. I'm sure we'll have you back at some point to not only talk about what's happening in the space of medical device law, but importantly, how it's impacting the development of AI law.
So thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us, Scott. Appreciate it.
With that, I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.